My first story is about Tesla's battery in Australia. So the context is that in back in 2016, there was a fairly large power outage in South Australia, which is a state in Australia. And it happened because of a storm that knocked out a couple of power lines. And so, previous to that, South Australia has demolished a lot of coal capacity and was increasingly installing wind power capacity. And so, it was unable to domestically generate enough power uh, to keep the lights on. And then, load shedding happened, and a lot of homes were without power for some substantial time period. And
So this, by the way, I just want to interrupt on this. This is definitely not the way that the story has been portrayed, because the way the story has been portrayed is that somehow coal is unreliable, wind is reliable. When there's a problem on the grid, it's caused by coal, and then Elon Musk came to the rescue by creating a giant battery that gave the whole system a huge amount of backup time, so that next time coal failed, his battery could, in an instantaneous and long-lasting way, give people continuous power. And in fact, I was on a trip to Hawaii, and I was with some nice Australian people on a horseback ride, and they told me this story.
yeah, it was definitely like from the media headlines, you would get that impression. So, so what happened then? Tesla came to the rescue, installed a big battery, and lithium-ion battery in South Australia, and therefore provided backup capacity for the wind power. And so, just last January, there was a big heat wave in Australia. Australia, of course, is in the southern hemisphere and now experiences summer season. And the problem then was that there were still some power outages. I think a couple of thousand households were without power. And this heat wave generated a lot of demand in terms of air conditioning. Uh, and so then the question was, what happened? And there was some calculation by a member of parliament, Craig Kelly, who calculated that the Tesla battery at the time of peak demand on January 24th provided 30 megawatts of power, and that was less than 1% of South Australia's total demand. And so just 3 hours later, it fizzled out. And so I didn't notice that at the time this battery was hyped, but it's only a 100 megawatt, 129 megawatt hours capacity battery attached to one wind farm in South Australia. And so it's obviously totally not sufficient to provide any kind of backup. So, and as Craig Kelly calculated, something like 97% of power supply came from fossil fuels during the crucial hours of this sort of emergency weather event. And so, just as wind had a trough in generation in the afternoon, the battery wasn't even fully charged, apparently. So it only provided 100 megawatt hours of the 129 of nominal capacity. And so wind power failed, and the battery backup also failed. And so this was totally not predictable from the media headlines. But, when looking at the numbers, of course, a Tesla battery is so small, it's just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, that's what I find really irresponsible. I think you read this too. I read a report from the Global Warming Policy Foundation. I forget what it was called, but they have really interesting reports, by the way, often. And they had one that was on storage and the different approaches to storage. One of the big points it made is that just battery storage is so inferior to what we could call hydro storage, where you use excess energy at a given time to pump water vertically, and then later you basically use it as a hydroelectric dam to generate energy later. Like that's just that you can't do everywhere. There are a bunch of issues with it, but it's just so much more efficient than having batteries, which have all these issues. And I believe it made the point. I don't remember the exact percentage, but it was some very tiny percentage of this battery, just based on its size, is just totally inadequate. I think it was maybe it had, they said at full charge, it would give 4 minutes of backup capacity for a given section of the grid. I'm not sure how much of South Australia that was, but you just think about 4 minutes and how many of the, it would be a good research project. How many of the news stories, we should actually do this. How many of the news stories about this world's biggest battery mentioned how much actual power it could provide in meaningful terms? It's not meaningful to just say, oh, 129 megawatt hours, that's huge. You would want to know, okay, how big is that actually? And then, and if you just think about it logically, okay, a Tesla, Tesla with what is it, ludicrous mode? I think ludicrous mode is the highest one. Where if you get a Tesla 100D, okay, that's 100 kilowatt hours. So that is and that's 1,000th of 100 megawatt hours, and this is 129 megawatt hours. So basically, you're dealing with 1,290 Tesla worth of battery storage, and people might have some common sense intuition. Oh yeah, that's not going to be that much. And those Teslas are not going to be able to power like a whole grid. And if that's super, super expensive, then it's not a good solution to try to have these unreliable power sources and then somehow have batteries make it up, because it's just, that's just not anywhere near enough power.
And part of the story was that, Elon Musk came in and had this wager, like if they wouldn't erect this battery storage in a short period of time, South Australia would get it for free. So it definitely was set up as, okay, we have this problem with intermittency, but that's not really a problem because Tesla will just come in and build the world's biggest battery. It's just, if you want it, you can get it.
Yeah, he should. If I ever get the chance to debate him, this would be an interesting subject to get into the details of. He's quite selective in terms of what he wants to get into the details of. Also, I think I saw in your notes that during the heat wave, didn't prices go up by some huge multiple?
Yeah, so the wholesale prices jumped to over 14,000 Australian dollars per megawatt hour, which is like 2 orders of magnitude larger than under normal operations. Which is normal if you have an emergency, then the last kilowatt hour, the marginal kilowatt hour will spike in prices. So there were some calculations on the web. Something like 500 Australian dollars per family. I don't know how accurate this is. I didn't make the calculation, but that's the order of magnitude what we are looking at in the case of this emergency.
Yeah, it's something like 300 times more than it conventionally costs. And when you deal with these supply constraints, and when you have these grids that are just that have all of these risks built in because they don't have sufficient reliable power and they have all this unreliable power, when people are making up these cost estimates, they're not talking about these crunches, because these crunches, I mean, think about it. If it makes the price 300 times higher, how long does it take to make up for that? And then let alone, as we've discussed on other recent shows, if you have a blackout, I mean, what's the cost of that? So the one thing I've started to appreciate the last several shows even more is just how important it is that energy be affordable, and how just the standard cited operating cost of energy can be very distorted, both because it can ignore all these hidden costs, particularly with the unreliable forms that have all these dependencies that people aren't accounting for. But then also with any kind of lack of reliability, you then have the risk of these surges in price, and then the blackouts, which just make everything so expensive, and that can negate years of otherwise low prices.